Добро вечер и добро дојдовте во ново издание на Движење Бойкотирам во живо. Вечерва тука само со мене. Арно, ама нема да бидам сам. Леđа не е тука вечерва. Ќе имам интересен гостин од Шкотска. Да ве подсетам само пред да го поздравиме нашиот вечерашен гостин, само да ве подсетам дека одиме на 4 платформи, на YouTube и на Facebook. Одиме и на Rumble, одиме и на Twitter. Ако не гледате на YouTube и на Facebook, ќе ве поканам сега да се префрлите на Rumble или на Twitter и таму да не гледате. Значи, интервјуто денес ќе биде на англиски. Се надеваме дека тоа нема да биде проблем за никој да го разбери. И ќе видиме, пошто интервјуто ќе оди во живо, ќе видиме да обезбедиме до следната емисија или до следните епизоди да обезбедиме некаков превод за луѓето кои што малце потешко им оди англискиот, а за сите други уживајте во нашето интервју со господинот Alastair Stewart од Шкотска и да започнеме. Ајде, Аце. Hello, good evening, and we are, as I said in my Macedonian kind of introduction, our guest tonight is Alastair Stewart, who is a columnist, a Scottish columnist. Actually, I will let you introduce yourself in however capacity you would want. So please introduce yourself.
No, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. My name is Alastair Stewart. I am a Scottish-based columnist. I'm a freelance writer. I'm also a public affairs director in Scotland. That means I work with a lot of politicians. That's what I do in the day job. Personally, and an overlap with the professional, is I'm married to a Macedonian. So I've got Macedonian relatives in Gabgalia. And throughout Macedonia, and over the last 7 years I've developed a great love for the country, for its traditions, for its culture. I am trying desperately, and forgive me, to learn the language. My love for the country is far ahead my ability to speak the language, so there's no disrespect intended, but it is within those capacities that I find myself here today, and it's great to join you.
Great. Maybe the next time you visit us, we will try to have a conversation in Macedonian. If your
That's quite the challenge. I'll take that. I'll take that challenge. If you have me back, I'll have that challenge.
Yeah. So I think you are somewhat familiar to Macedonian audiences because you have been a guest of Macedonian media in the past. I think you kind of. Macedonian media got you on the radar after you wrote an article way back in 2018, I believe it was, in which you kind of expressed some reservations about the then potential adoption of the Prespa agreement. Can you kind of, for our audience, kind of talk about that article and what inspired you to basically write and what it basically said?
Absolutely. This was a rare convergence of holiday meets the professional, and it was my first visit to Macedonia. The family took a visit to Greece, and as happened, we were at a bar about 1 o'clock in the morning, and things were getting translated for me, but it became very apparent that a group, the table over in this bar in Greece, were talking about Macedonia. And the language they were using was choice. I was always told that if we're going to try and learn a language, the best thing to do first is learn the curse words and the swear words so you know exactly where things are. And it was very apparent what people were saying. And it was my now wife and my brother-in-law, who were kicking me under the table and saying, don't say anything. And my response to this was like, what are you, like, we can't sit here and listen to this. This is just absolute rubbish. This is slander. It was racist. It was xenophobic. It was jingoistic. And it was bandied around with such aggression and such nonchalantness in a crowded bar. And that, in conversation with my father-in-law, who's just Vito, who is just a phenomenal teacher of Macedonian history, a genuine patriot for his country, brought me up to speed on the issues and the context. And that's what prompted me to write an article for the Scotsman newspaper. Has global circulation, but there wasn't at that point much knowledge in the UK about Macedonia and that specific topic, and certainly about Prespa. It ignited quite a lot of interest. There was a death threat that was made. It was still one of the funniest death threats I've ever received. It was a gentleman
Wow.
it was a gentleman from Australia, of all things, who threatened to kill me and then beat me up. And I was curious as to why you would beat up a corpse, but that's by the by. That's how they, if that's how they want to roll, that's how they want to roll. But a long story short is it generated a great deal of discussion about the particulars of what this agreement meant. And I came at it from certainly a familial perspective, and even more now because we've just welcomed our son Alexander. But at the time, it was a part academic, part journalistic, part political, and part just damn curiosity. What the hell is going on with this situation? Because to me, it looks like a bunch of other countries are telling another country to change their name, change their identity, hand over education control and everything else. So you have access to the EU and NATO and all these other things. That is a very high level, I appreciate, look at it and snapshot, as we would say in English. But that was the context at the time, and it started a genuine interest of mine. And over the years since, as you noticed, or noted, I've written further pieces for the Times, for additional Scottish publications. I've worked with the United Macedonian Diaspora, trying to figure out what's going on, but more critically, educate people in Western Europe as to the personal part of this. It's not just geopolitics and another thing you hear on the news. These are real people. It's not just family, but it's real people with their own culture, with their own identity, with their own language, who are being picked on, as I understand it, and again, this is my opinion, picked on quite successively by both the European Union and neighbouring countries that keep moving the goalposts to access things which the UK, as it happened, just walked away from overnight. And there was this bizarre convergence, but that is a long story short as to where my involvement began and where it is today.
I think your kind of perspective on this is really unique. I mean, you do have some connection with Macedonia, but in general, you kind of represent a more kind of dispassionate observer, or I would say the most dispassionate observer from the West that the Macedonian public has had the opportunity to hear. So I think in that sense, it was very interesting to hear someone kind of voice the same kind of concerns that Macedonians in general had for the Prespa agreement in that form. So
I appreciate you saying that. There was a lot of convergence with, and there was a lot of things that I understood with what had been happening in Scotland and with what had been happening with the UK in the years since anyway, and before that. So Scotland had had its own independence referendum. It's an issue that was celebrated its 10th anniversary just last week. The UK referendum on EU membership dragged on for years to actually leave the European Union, and there is some debate as to whether or not that was a good idea or not, and that is an entire discussion in itself, and it's unique in that respect because it was a very peculiarly British experience. In terms of people who write about Macedonia, the problem that I've noticed is that they'll write about Macedonia and they'll write about the Balkans, but not unpack the confusion that a lot of people who may not know about that area of the world feel. I'm a big believer that that is actually not the public's fault. it's a perpetuated just propagation that Winston Churchill, I've got many books about Churchill behind me. I'm great interest in his life, said that the Balkans produces more history than anyone can possibly consume. In a daily news cycle, it is impossible to constantly reiterate and dissect and discuss from a Western perspective all of the complexities of the Macedonian issue. So when you see the likes of the BBC and other news outlets, it tends to be more region specific that they're discussing. And within that noise, you'll actually lose a lot of the nuance. And because of that, you'll lose a lot of the problems that Macedonia is facing within what I would call the noise collectively on a region by region basis. So in a very small way, when I do write about Macedonia, I'm writing from trying to educate people. And one of the ways that is to say, educate my own sort of audience over here. And one of the ways I found to do that is to draw comparisons to what an independent Scotland would face if it was to go down the route of becoming an independent nation from the UK. And if the reaction to the original Prespa article that I wrote in 2018 provoked that kind of reaction, the reaction I got when I suggested that an independent Scotland would face the same fate as Macedonia went through the roof. There were a lot of angry people over here who it got very ugly. They were saying that how could you possibly compare such and it was ugly language, which you know, how could you possibly compare such a renewable, very arrogant, renewable, rich country like Scotland and an established country like Scotland to Macedonia? And I said, my argument then is my argument is now, hold on a minute. Geopolitics is geopolitics. Not just because you're friendly to the world doesn't mean the world is going to be friendly to you. Just because you happen to have neighbors that you're getting along with at the moment doesn't mean that you're going to be getting along with them tomorrow. And when I do write about these issues, it's apparent to me that other journalists, other writers don't have the capacity to delve deeper and try and convey the day-to-day experiences of ordinary Macedonians. Now, I would never be arrogant enough to say that I have a pipeline to that. I am not a knowledge bank. I, in that respect, am an amateur, but I listen closely to what friends and family say there, and I try and convey it in an honest way to audiences here. And I will say that audiences here are interested. And if there was more of an interest in what's going on in Macedonia, I think there'd be much more attention given to things like the Prespa Agreement, the caveats and the oxymorons applied towards like friendship treaties. And I think there would be concentrated discussion on it. And it's a shame that there's not, but there should be.
I have to tell you that, like, here in Macedonia, the impression that we get from when, like, the European Union or in general the representatives of the West, they sort of think this is too complicated. Just get it over somehow. You know, figure it out somehow. Solve it with a Balkan-like method. It seems like they don't want to kind of. They don't want any part of this mess. This is what we kind of feel. But I also saw in one of your guest appearances in Macedonian TV that you said that not a lot is known about this. I mean, a lot is known about the Balkans, but as you said, as a monolith, as like the Balkans. But not a lot is actually known about the specific situations that individual countries, not just Macedonia, individual countries are kind of facing. Do you feel like the work that you've done has helped a little bit to get more people informed about the specifics of the situation, or is that something that requires a longer and more consistent I think we have the same sound issue that we had previously. Nope. I think you switched to mics or something, yes, when we were trying it. No.
Any,
Nope. Come again? Nope.
any better with that?
Oh, now it sounds better.
Perfect. We're back.
All right.
I think, apologies for that. I think it would require a concentrated, massive, monumental shift in emphasis to focus on Macedonia. There's an expression that I'm quite fond of. It's great men are forged in fire. It's the privilege of lesser men to light the flame. I can write the odd article about Macedonia. I can have the odd appearance on Macedonian TV. I can do blogs. I can say these things, but Western attention, Western media has to have a concentrated long-term focus to dissect these issues. But there's another aspect there that you touched on, which I think is interesting, is that there's a dichotomy that's split between Macedonia and the Balkans as a region and the European Union. It's almost A or B, and we need to bring A and B together. The experience of the UK over the Brexit referendum is that everyone forgets that David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, tried to reform the European Union before the Brexit referendum. And most people, if you asked them in the street, couldn't quite tell you what the European Union did, how it operated, what it meant, what the cost was to the taxpayer, what the overall benefits were. And that's a problem not only for how we understand the European Union, but how people understand the Balkans as well. In terms of politicians trying to just get issues over with very quickly, I completely agree with you. There's a temptation to say, we've got a problem here, let's solve it any way we can, let's just do something. That happened with the UK, and that happened with Brexit. It was a binary yes, no. It didn't resolve anything. It didn't resolve anything at all. It made things infinitely more complicated by oversimplifying it. What we need is a generation of journalists with the capacity and the interest and the focus to hone in on what's happening in Macedonia and discuss it and report on it regularly to educate Western audiences. I try not to talk about the US presidential election because I'm sick to death of hearing about it. I really am. I've got family who live in America, but the idea of the whole Donald Trump thing or Biden or Kamala Harris, I see more about that on the BBC and other British news websites and international websites every hour than I do about European issues. And I've never understood that. I understand that there's an element of powerful country, powerful position, but there's a drama, there's an interest. And
it's the bigger spectacle, I think.
Absolutely. If you have room for that, then you should have room for considered journalism about expanding the European Union and the benefits and the pitfalls facing countries such as Macedonia.
I was going to say that, like, where does someone outside of Macedonia, like, okay, you have some connection with Macedonia, you have a part of your family in Macedonia, and you can hear firsthand about how Macedonians feel about this whole thing. But like, where do you think someone without that kind of a shortcut to Macedonian sensitivities, where would they hear? I think what I'm trying to say is I think it's a responsibility of Macedonian journalists and Macedonia in general to kind of present its case to the world. I think we're very inwardly focused, and my basic question is, where would an English-speaking person get information about Macedonia?
I think that's an incredibly interesting question. The first one can be answered accidentally. So if something happens or there's something going on, you'll see something in, say, the BBC or CNN or something. There's been an election, presidential election in Macedonia. Something has happened. There it is. Snapshot. It will be forgotten tomorrow. But I've just become very aware that for the duration of this conversation, I've placed the onus entirely on the West as being the ones who are responsible for educating Westerners on what's happening in Macedonia. There needs to be a concentrated effort of advocacy groups to explain in an objective way to Western audiences what is going on, how people can educate themselves, and how they can get involved if they want to. I'll give you an example of that, is that I work with many charities and advocacy groups, and I do a lot of communications work for them. And if they give me a press release, the press release is usually in its first form quite aggressive. It's forward driven. We are right. They are wrong. This is what we need. We're not getting enough money. And I take a red pen and I go, everyone will think that that's biased, that you're prejudiced. If you're wanting to engage people's interests, you have to ensure that they have objective information. So there is an onus on Macedonian advocacy groups to present information correctly and factually so that it's reported on by Western journalists. That is critical. But also there needs to be serious, considered, balanced journalism from Macedonia that is more widely reported, making better use of social media, making better use of press wire services that relays facts and figures, and it breaks down a very complicated historic story into a digestible amount that people will report on and continue to report on, so a momentum builds. And until that happens, not much is going to change. Macedonia will still remain a place over there with another Balkan thing that's happening, and no one is going to join the dots. Serious change is needed.
In one of your articles, I know you kind of create like a parallel between the Scottish kind of how Scotland maintained its national identity and kind of like its Scottishness within the broader United Kingdom, and how that you made a very interesting parallel between that and the requirements that have been placed on Macedonia with the various agreements that it's been sort of forced to sign. I thought that was very interesting. How do you view how would you say that the Prespa agreement undercuts the ability of Macedonia to maintain its kind of national national identity in a way that, for example, it's not the problem in Scotland within the United Kingdom?
Education. To quote Tony Blair, education, education, education. Any country that hands control of its textbooks that are being taught to children to joint commissions has lost its mind. It's gone crazy. For the very simple reason that that is how truths and untruths are perpetuated that destroy cultures. The example with Scotland is very interesting because Scotland and England came together, they were separate countries, and they joined together in 1707. But part of the caveat of that arrangement, that alignment, was that Scotland retained control over its law, over its health, and over its education system. So if you look closely at the news, you'll see that, there'll be something in England about education system collapsing or whatever it is. And then Scotland, there'll be a story about free tuition fees for higher education. Those are things which are controlled. And they were always controlled, even before the Scottish Parliament was reintroduced in 97. is that they were always separately controlled, always. So Scottish identity was perpetuated, and there's always question marks that we're focusing too much on this or too much on that, but the general gist of it was always safeguarded. Now, if you have education on the table as part of international treaty making, you've lost your mind completely, because if you had a list of all the things that I would be prepared to negotiate on, education would be a non-negotiable. It's the one thing that how cultures define themselves. It doesn't matter who's accusing you of irredentism, or if there's a contestation, or if Alexander the Great is Macedonian, or if he's great. None of it matters. What matters is that people identify as themselves, and they have a right to teach their children how they want to teach their children. That is the basis of every country in the world.
In that sense, I would say Scotland is even more independent without being an independent country than Macedonia. Wouldn't you say?
Completely. Scottish education is by no means perfect, and I'm not saying it is, nor am I inferring that it is. But in terms of the content of what goes in academic textbooks, that is decided by Scottish politicians. When we were joined together with the United Kingdom before devolution, before Scotland had its parliament back, there was still a Scottish department within the UK that decided and protected that. It's a non-negotiable. Every book on nationalism, it begins by saying that national identity is defined by two things: education and language and culture. It is as simple as that. And if you start negotiating some of it and not other of it, and make the terrible mistake of handing control over those things to quote unquote independent commissions who hold black pens and start, no, didn't happen.
And are politically appointed, let's not forget.
And there is not a committee on God's green earth that has ever been appointed apolitically, ever. Everything has a political context, all of it. But organic things like language and education and culture are things which need to be protected. The Gaelic language in Scotland is not widely spoken, but there are rural communities within Scotland where it is, and there's a concern that it will be lost to, and this is going even further back, that it will be lost to the advance of English, and it will be forgotten about. There's legislation that Scotland has introduced to protect that. It's not dissimilar to what Canada has done. It's very different, but not dissimilar to what Canada has done with French and English. The point is that both of these countries have the self-awareness to know that their own citizens feel and act and have certain cultural attributes, and therefore it's the duty of every government to protect that and to do it to the best of their abilities. Can you imagine what would happen if Scotland was going for independence or had voted for independence, and there was a negotiation with England that what went in Scottish textbooks would be decided by a joint commission of English and Scottish commissioners? It would be, I don't even know where to begin with how funny the response would be. There would be protests on the streets at that, ignoring the good humour of an Australian playing a Scotsman in the most famous movie that Scotland has produced. But that aside, it would be madness. And that to me was one of the most crazy things about Prespa and subsequent discussions, that it would hand that specific thing over.
I heard you say about in your appearance on Macedonian TV that if the same thing happened in Scotland, which happened in Macedonia, if the same thing was required of Scots, what was required of Macedonians, that there would be protests every day on the street. And I mean, that makes sense to me. Why do you think this sort of thing passes in Macedonia but would not?
I don't know.
What is your dispassionate third party opinion about that?
It's a good question, and I will be honest. I'm heading into territory where I have no business speculating on why Macedonians feel the way that they feel, and I don't want to be accused of being the arrogant Westerner who's telling Macedonians how Macedonians feel and how Macedonians act. If I had to have a suspicion, if I had to take a guess, I would say fatigue and tiredness, that there's a loss of faith in governments, that there's a comparison to be made with what happened in and has repeatedly happened in Catalonia, in Spain, that there's such a strong centrist authoritarian vibe from central government that there's just a general feeling that no matter what I say, even if I protested, very little would change. Those are very different contexts, but I'm speculating as to a Macedonian context. But I do know, speaking to Macedonian family and Macedonian friends, that the anger is there and the frustration is there, but there is a tiredness. It's an issue which has been going on for at least 30 years. Obviously, if you presume from the initial breakup of Yugoslavia, if you take that from that day till now, there's a tiredness, there's a fatigue. But the problem is, if that fatigue is now transferring over to young people, and those young people who are active in every way imaginable, on every issue imaginable, whether it be gender identity or the environment or anything, why is that same passion not happening on the streets of Macedonia? Where is it? Where is the concern over the possible deconstruction of your own country? And I don't have an answer to these things. But I can offer a speculation. The only thing I will say is, as a father now to a child who is half Macedonian, is that I would sincerely hope that, God forbid, if this issue in some form or another was still in place in 20 years, they would be politically active and have a thing or two to say about it, because you can't slowly destroy a country by inaction. It's criminal.
So there has been 6 years already that this is a reality for Macedonia. I mean, back when you wrote the article, it was a potential thing, but now it is a reality for Macedonia. The Prespa agreement, the negotiations with the Bulgarians, the negotiations with the EU. I know when you were on Macedonian TV, the kind of the person you talked to, he was really adamant about, but we entered NATO, but that's the only way for us to enter the European Union. He seemed to have been pushing the narrative that we have to do this because we will get something, we will sacrifice something, but we will get something, which I think is a completely bonkers proposition. But let's say that's what some people in Macedonia, that's the argument that they make. We've had 6 years to see the effect of this supposed benefit that we were supposed to be getting out of this whole idea. Has your opinion about this entire situation changed in the intervening 6 years? Do you think that us being members of NATO has somehow benefited us in a way that we might overlook some of the worst aspects of the agreements? Or do you think...
It's a good question. I can view the answer to that from the Western perspective, and ask, has it changed the perception of Macedonia from a prestige point of view? Do people more generally regard it as somehow being a better country, a country to do business with just because it's in NATO? again, that goes back to what our initial conversation is. Is Macedonia regularly discussed in the Western media? Not to my knowledge. Is Macedonia somehow considered to be the signature frontline defense of what is happening in Ukraine? No. NATO is a massive umbrella organization. Everyone, and we can all have our separate opinions on its validity and its effectiveness, but NATO is an umbrella organization which has to have, by definition of what it is militarily, it has to have its constituent parts. Do I think that Macedonia sacrificing what Macedonia sacrificed, the government at the time sacrificing what it sacrificed to join that, was worthwhile? Not necessarily, because NATO is a worst case scenario organization. There was discussion of Macedonia for a week, if a little longer, when it joined, when that discussion was happening. But again, it's not sustained a momentum in the wider issues and the wider complexities. If I was a Macedonian, I would be much more concerned as to why are my politicians discussing these things repeatedly on an international stage? They're trying to look good, sound good, look powerful. What's happening with the cost of living standards?
Good? Are they sounding good?
What's happening with cost of living standards? Is the quality of life in Macedonia improving overall? Are the renewables, is there higher investment? Is there more going on? Oil and gas prices, are they coming down? Those are the issues that most people in most countries matter and feel matter, and have politicians who try and act and strike international deals on that basis. And so it's impossible to say that an obsession for 6 years has improved that situation for ordinary Macedonians. I mentioned earlier that on Wednesday, the 18th of September, was the 10th anniversary of the referendum on Scottish independence. We have a similar situation here where education and most domestic policy areas are an absolute disaster zone. And that's because the government of the day, the nationalist government that is in power in Holyrood, has spent 10 years saying that if only we had been independent, things would be better. If we are independent again, all of these issues will be resolved. And yet they tend to ignore the obvious example of Brexit, which is that Brexit, while a vote to leave the EU, led to 5-6 years of painful negotiation, slow-moving negotiation, all while the cost of living crisis got worse in the UK, the energy crisis got worse in the UK, the mortgage crisis, the banking crisis, the financial crisis, every crisis got worse. And yet politicians are focusing on the big issues. Macedonia, I think, from, again, that Western perspective looking in, it's even worse. Why are we hyper-focusing on NATO and EU membership? Surely there should be more practical discussion about, and they're important issues, yes, but they're not the only issues. Surely there should be more practical conversations about improving the cost of living and the quality of life for ordinary voters in that country.
And it's also they are ignoring the sort of thing that we were discussing, the fact that this is sort of casting a shadow on the ability of Macedonia to nurture its identity. That's also being completely ignored in favor of we have to be a good ally to NATO. We have to continue on this path to the EU. Whatever they ask of us, we need to give them, because as most politicians, I wouldn't even say most, I would say all politicians in Macedonia say Macedonia has no alternative. Macedonia must join the EU. And I wanted to ask you, as someone recently Brexited and someone
Brexited. I enjoy that. I've been Brexited.
Yes. And as someone who I think in general understands the utility and the kind of the positive side of the European Union. Do you think that that's true? Do you think that Macedonia has to continue on the road to EU, whatever the cost?
I think whatever the cost is the part of that question, which is what makes it so specifically interesting. Brexit was a disaster for the UK for a multitude of reasons. It wasted years of legislative time focusing on the particulars. There is now noteworthy data that we are significantly worse off outside of the EU in terms of freedom of movement, in terms of goods and services, you name it. It's not a particularly positive pile. In the positive pile, you have people who say that we've got our national sovereignty back. I would argue that national sovereignty doesn't really exist in the 21st century. Every country is somehow interdependent on somewhere else, so that's an illusion. As for the only option available to Macedonia, no, it's not. What you need are a mature set of politicians who don't pass the buck, as we say, and do what's happening in Scotland, which is that every solution facing Scotland, every problem facing Scotland has the same solution: independence. Not every problem facing Macedonia, not every improvement, not every ambition, not every goal, not every future of every young person is going to be solved overnight with EU membership.
Exactly.
It also, you can't continue to pass the buck and say, oh, if this happens, and then spend another 10 years or another 15 years or another 30 years fixating on it if the EU is even around. The common thread that the UK and Macedonia share is that the EU itself needs to reform fundamentally to deliver those benefits for its members. And if you look closely at the data for countries like France and Spain in particular, disenfranchisement and the feeling that the EU is this construct that exists, but exists quite far away and doesn't yield a tangible benefit, the people feeling that way, that's increasing. So not only does the EU need to reform, but national governments themselves need to form better, more practical and more immediate solutions to immediate problems facing their own citizens. The case in Macedonia, there's a massive amount that needs to be done. It continues to rate below average in many league tables globally. Those are issues that can be addressed at a national level by national governments. EU membership is not some myth and over the rainbow solution to these problems. So I'm not avoiding the question. I think EU membership has an important part to play, but it's not an overnight fix to very serious long-term problems that have been neglected for quite some time. The UK and Macedonia and Scotland all share this problem. It's a lot of time spent discussing grandiose, sweeping constitutional changes while domestic agendas affecting the pound in people's pocket, as we say, continues to be affected drastically and in a worsening state.
So is it your opinion that the EU has to reform in order to survive? Because I mean, Brexit
without question. David Cameron's mistake prior to the Brexit referendum is that he spent too little time seriously trying to advocate for reform of the European Union. We knew that a vote was coming. I think a binary vote, a yes, no, was stupid beyond belief, because it's a multi-layered membership, whether it be a currency or freedom of movement or certain laws and so forth and so forth and so forth. He did not try hard enough to seriously reform it from the inside. No one has learned the lesson, that reverse lesson of Brexit, since the UK left. It hasn't galvanized a series of reforms. It hasn't made people address the fear that it's becoming more of a forever centralizing body at the expense of national governments. Yes, it has to reform. Whether or not it's capable of reforming and what mechanism it can take to reform is a totally different question. And you may get into the crazy situation that by the time that Bulgaria lifts its forever lengthening lists of caveats to keep Macedonia out of the EU as we know it today, in the same way the EU that we understood it in 2016, may not only look completely different, but it might not actually exist as we understand it today, unless something happens. The increase in support for far-right parties across Europe collectively also seems to reflect a general sentiment that something has to be done. Who will listen? Will they listen? Will anything happen? Are different questions, but they need answers.
What do you think the likely reaction of the... I don't want to use this West as like, there's no such thing as a West. It's not a conglomerate. It's not a monolith. You know, there's a lot of different interests there. But what do you think the reaction of the West, conditionally speaking, the West would be if
I'll do it with you, the West.
If Macedonia tomorrow would say, this is too much for us. We would rather stop here and not continue.
That's an interesting question. I suppose as a communications professional, it would be how you say it and how loudly you say it. It would have to depend on what the cause of that rejection would be. My concern with how Macedonia communicates with the world more generally, and how advocacy groups communicate with the world more generally on behalf of Macedonia, is no one has mastered taking a very complicated history with a very complicated set of current circumstances and explaining them simply and continuing that momentum. So if Macedonia was to wake up tomorrow morning as a country and say, you know what, the EU can go to hell, I think you'd get 5 minutes of airtime. I think it would be forgotten about quite quickly. And that's more a reflection on the failures of successive Macedonian governments to make Macedonia a global news story consistently and regularly. I keep going back to the example of the US presidential elections. I know more now about Kamala Harris than I ever deliberately set out to know. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's a focus of the media. The UK and the so-called special relationship ain't that special anymore. So from a British perspective, I don't know why we're obsessed so much about it, except for the entertainment value of it, which it brings. But much more needs to be done to insert Macedonia into the regular, as you say, quote unquote, Western news cycle. And if that was achieved, then announcements like we're doing X, Y, or Z, or we're saying yes to the European Union, or we're saying no to the European Union, it would be taken with far greater notice, not least of all given Macedonia's strategic importance, which we've not even touched on. And I think that would have a lasting impact for the fortune and the investment of the country. But the onus is on the governments of the day to do that, and those representing the country. The challenge is huge to draw that kind of attention to Macedonia.
All right, before we go to the questions, one last thing I would like to ask you is, as a PR strategist, what is your advice to Macedonian Macedonians? How do they improve the messaging? How do they basically do what you are suggesting them to do? What would be good first steps?
the depoliticize as much as possible. That's the lesson that I think Scotland learned in the independence referendum. And I think it's the lesson that was taught very harshly during the Brexit debate. By depoliticize, I mean that you need reputable, reliable sourcing and reporting and journalism of what the facts actually are. And I don't want to get into
this is the knife in our heart. There is no such thing here.
No, not at all. Conversations like this are critical, because having a free exchange of thoughts and having a discussion and having places like here organized by yourselves where you can actually have honest conversations are key to it. What's missing from a national perspective is government that makes information readily available to those who may not know what's going on. If you look at the UK, if you look at Scotland, if you look at the House of Commons, House of Lords, if you even look at the White House, it's very transparent who's who does what the functions are, what current policy issues are, what current legislative agenda is, and so forth. From a PR perspective, from a comms perspective, the depoliticization that I'm referring to means that when you have some kind of central source of information, journalistically or from an advocacy group perspective, you change the focus from voicing your opinion to relaying the facts so that those facts will be reported on. Journalists are not lazy people, but they're busy people, and they will take press releases, and the idea is that if a press release has been sent to them, it requires minimal changes, and then they can report it. That's how it's done so quickly. If they're getting press releases from advocacy groups and politicians saying X is terrible, Y is lying, and using rhetoric and language like that, it's not going to be picked. It's not going to be used internationally. It's not going to get that kind of traction. More podcasts and more discussion groups like this are critical. They form a key component because it gets people energized. You've been kind enough to invite me on. You get genuine discussion going. But from an advocacy group perspective, from a PR perspective, and from a government perspective, depoliticize, put out information as it is. The Scottish government is extremely good at that. If you look at the news section of the Scottish government, that's separate to the government of the day, run by the SNP and the actual government. If you go on the SNP website, Scottish National Party website that's in power, Westminster's destroying Scotland, there's been X billion of cuts, and so forth and so forth. If you go in the news section of the Scottish government website, it's very different. It's 20 billion has been removed from Westminster. The Cabinet Secretary for the Economy has responded by saying, and notes to the relevant documents. There needs to be more of that. And if there's more of that comms shift, I think there'll be more conversation internationally about Macedonia, which there should be.
It's a hard thing to achieve for sure here because we're such a small market. And it's so hard to make to be a journalist without being influenced by, government money, interest money. We have the normal problems that all East European countries have. So yeah, it's
every country has. Scotland and the UK have those issues where there's obviously tabloid newspapers. There's newspapers with a political lean. But there's a difference between a political leaning and then just wholesale rhetoric and language, which is
outright
not
propaganda, basically. Yeah,
propaganda. That there's a difference. That I'll give you an example where the Guardian is quite well known for having a centre-left leaning perspective. The Daily Telegraph is quite well known for having a centre-right leaning perspective. But they're serious newspapers manned by serious journalists. And they're governed by codes of conduct, that if they were to just go down the route of shameless propaganda, they would lose their international foothold as household names. Macedonia needs to do a version of that where they're conveying incredibly complicated issues in a way that these outlets will understand and report on and continue reporting on, because these issues are not going away. I'm well aware that that was a long answer to a short question, but there is a lot of work that can be done, and I hope it is done, because it's a country deserving of attention.
All right. I think Alexander, our producer, wrote 14 questions that we should look at. So let's just try to get through them as soon as possible. Gotsem is asking, the two first references to Macedonia for anyone in the West are Alexander the Great and the Bible, in essence, St. Paul. What did Alastair know about Macedonia before he married his wife?
That's a fantastic question, and has put me on the spot. Not much is the honest answer. I was the first one on Google Maps when Zarisa told me that she was from Macedonia and that we were going there for a visit. I had an understanding of Yugoslavia, and I was aware of Macedonia because I had an interest, as I mentioned, in the Second World War and Winston Churchill, and meetings with Tito, and that aspect.
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt. We must have you on about Winston Churchill one of these days, because I don't know if you're following, but there is a huge controversy brewing in the United States about the role of Winston Churchill in World War II. That's a wholly separate conversation. But I think
would now be a bad time to shamelessly tell you that I am the chair of the International Churchill Society of Scotland. So I'm your man. Absolutely.
Awesome. I would love to have that discussion, because I don't think it's an issue that a lot of people in Macedonia are kind of following, but it's super interesting for me. So yeah, I think it's also important. How would I say? Because of the politics of the moment, it's also very important to kind of disambiguate the role of Winston Churchill.
Churchill, in many ways, is an example of the kind of contemporary revisionism that I think Macedonia suffers from, or the accusation is levied against Macedonia all the time. And I don't have an answer how to stop that. I just know that it continues and changes every day. And with an interest in both, I see a different accusation levied every day. But to return to that, yes, to coming back to discussing Churchill, but as to my knowledge of Macedonia before I met my wife, no, it was limited. In fact, specifically, it was limited to, we met in our nations and nationalism class at university, and we were discussing the breakup of Yugoslavia, aptly enough. So there was some use to that class for the long term. That was many years ago, but it was limited, and I'm very aware that my own ignorance is something I carried at the time and tried to correct, and I try and be as generous as possible to people when they hear that, I've got Macedonian in-laws and I know that they don't know where that is. It's part of the problem. But yes, hopefully that's answered that question as honestly as I can.
Yep. Rino is asking, does the guest support the independence of Scotland?
Ooh, that's on the spot.
Feel free to say pass.
I was tempted to cough and say I didn't hear the question, but the question is in front of me. No, I don't, but I do, for a variety of different reasons. I do not, but I do believe that there should be further powers, what are called reserved powers, that is to say powers that are controlled at Westminster in London, devolved to Scotland. In fact, I'm very much in favour of a federalised United Kingdom, but that is even less likely than reforming the European Union.
Another question from Reno. Does he consider the Prespa agreement as a legal document? He probably has no background in legal matters, but his opinion might be interesting for us. I think his question is, it's signed, it's been ratified. Is it unassailably legal?
That's a really good question. You are entirely correct. I am no lawyer at all. I would say, from my understanding of it, it's binding. I don't know if that would be considered the same as legal, but I would say that as a binding document, it would require some parliamentary approval to reverse. Whether or not that makes it legal, I can't answer that on a technical basis, but I would consider it to be binding, and therefore, as a binding document, it requires parliamentary intervention to undo the mess that it's in. I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm just acutely aware I'm not a lawyer.
All right. What does the guest think about Keir Starmer's moves to get the UK back into the EU? Wow.
Interesting to hear Keir Starmer. I don't think he will. I think he will try and have his cake and eat it, in that we'll have perhaps an improvement on certain things like freedom of movement, but and a slight relaxation on the movement of goods and services, but it will not come to any effect, because the Macedonians are tired of, and that fatigue I was talking about discussing Prespa and everything else. If Scotland is tired of discussing independence, we are exhausted by Brexit. And as much as I believe that the UK should return to the European Union for a variety of economic and social reasons, I don't think that there is a political appetite for it to take place. And Mr. Starmer would be on a suicide run if he tried to make that the centerpiece of his government, despite the overwhelming size of his recent parliamentary win. He's also got significant, although on the other side of that, he's got significant economic woes facing the UK government. There's a 22 billion black hole. If he really wanted to, he could try and make the case that access to the EU would resolve all of that. But I would be guilty of saying exactly the opposite of what I said earlier, that if Macedonian politicians were making the EU the solution to it, it would be a falsehood.
Exactly.
So I don't think he'll get very far, is the answer to that.
All right. Oh, this is a version of Alexander that you probably have not heard of, Atse, which is what
I have heard that.
Yes.
They've already started, or my family and friends have already started calling my boy that. So yes, no, I have heard that.
Okay, so Atse is asking, what is Alastair's opinion on the Macedonian-Greek dispute over Alexander the Great? Does he think he's Greek or Macedonian? Wow, you've been put on the spot multiple times.
I'm gonna safeguard everyone and say Macedonian. What I will say though is it's a case in point for textbooks, and education should come from countries themselves. And if there is any ambiguity and anything that's open to interpretation, if there's anything that's up for discussion, it should be part of serious scholarship and not scholarship directed by politicians. So I can think what I think, you can think what you think. Scholars should conduct scholarship. Politicians directing scholarship is a bad combination. So whatever my opinion is irrelevant, providing Macedonians feel how Macedonians feel, and if they feel that way, it should be protected.
Absolutely. Oil M1. Can we really say that EU Brussels bureaucrats are unelected? Aren't they elected by MEPs that we voted for?
Interesting question. I am guilty of conflating the phrase unelected bureaucrats with MEPs. My understanding of the European Commission and the European Parliament is the ability to actually introduce legislation in the way that you would in, say, Holyrood or the House of Commons is very different, but the overlap is significantly less. So in terms of bureaucratic diktats and what can be issued by the EU, I would say what most people have an issue with or had an issue with in the UK was the idea that you were getting directives to straighten bananas and all the rest of it from quote unquote unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah.
But MEPs had a role to play, but it was more representative as opposed to policy making. So I'm not dodging the question. I'm just clarifying where my own nomenclature overlaps a little bit. I think there are both, but I think when most people complain about the EU, they're complaining about the lack of legislative making ability from, say, their local representative. And that was a major problem during the Brexit debate. That was a major centerpiece.
Igor is asking, does the Prespa agreement go opposite the core values of the EU for human rights?
I would say yes, actually. That's a sweeping statement on the part of yours truly, but I would say yes. I very much take the view that self-determination is a protected right in the United Nations Charter, and that anything that hinders the self-determination making abilities, within reason, of course, of governments is fundamentally against human rights.
So this is an example of the depoliticization that you were talking about. We should not be talking about
absolutely
these people hate us and these people want to destroy us, but we should be making the case that it is a fundamental human right.
You're absolutely correct. There's a couple of questions there. I am guilty of saying things that I shouldn't be saying, because the depoliticization that I'm talking about, that if we were communicating the questions that have been relayed here to, say, national global media, you would have to have specific answers. You would have to have a specific answer, not my opinion as to whether or not Prespa is a legal or a binding document. And as for a question whether or not the Prespa agreement goes against human rights, there must be a legal answer to that. And then whatever that legal answer may be, whether we like it or not, is the basis of what the call to action would be. So I'm aware that there's a slight hypocrisy with me being a bit opinionated with answering some of these questions, but in terms of the comms advice that we were talking about earlier, depoliticize in terms of communicating globally.
Dolph is asking, Alastair, your opinion on SNP corruption, the loss of MPs, and the decline in independence desires.
Someone's done their homework. Ouch.
I didn't warn you. Our audience is very informed on a lot of different issues.
I've enjoyed speaking to your audience immensely. The SNP suffered a cash. The SNP are in power in Holyrood in Scotland at the moment, but they also send representatives to Westminster. They suffered at the last general election a catastrophic number of members of Parliament. They're severely weakened. It is possible that they will lose power in the Holyrood elections in 2026. And as a result of that, I don't think the desire of independence is gone from members, but it's an old quote. It was Reagan. I think it was Ronald Reagan talking about because he was a Democrat to begin with, but did the SNP leave independence voters, or did independence leave SNP voters? Some version of that I'll borrow and say that SNP members, as I understand them, and many of them are friends, are just gutted, as we say, that there is no tangible material path to achieve even an independence referendum again. It's off the table, and I think that the collapse of the SNP is quite imminent ahead of the next election.
All right. Adino again, has the guest experienced any problems regarding his advocacy about Macedonian issue against mainstream narratives?
I
think you mentioned that a little bit.
I mentioned a death threat or two. Some of the comments, the ones that spring to mind were I had the original article that we were talking about at the beginning of this, where family were kicking me under the table to not stand up and politely. And I'm not trying to present myself as some boorish Herculean type standing in the bar.
You weren't going to beat them up.
I was not, about to rip off the shirt and all the rest of it, but I was going to politely ask them to stop. That made me physically aware of the hostility against Macedonians. And then there have been several articles, even articles published in the Scottish press, where the comments have not only been vitriolic, but they've been violent, and there was one death threat, which I was quite proud of at the time, actually, because you don't get them very often. And I thought, oh, I've written something that's actually encouraged a response. But yes, some of my views have prompted quite strong responses. Usually, and unsurprisingly, Twitter is, which I try and avoid, is replete with people who are too cowardly to attach their name to aggressive comments and targeting family and all the rest of it. But unfortunately, that's the world in which we live in, anonymous social media posting, where you can say that but not stand by it.
Another question from Alastair. Does he think Macedonia belongs in the EU, primarily from a cultural point of view?
To be honest, I don't think I'm best placed to answer that question. I'm not Macedonian. It would have to...
But you've been exposed to the Macedonian culture. Do you think it's wholly alien to the EU?
I don't think... I don't think it's wholly alien. I think the experience of Britain, what I'm about to say makes it sound like I'm long in the tooth, as we say. I'm 36, so I'm going to mention the 70s, not as if I was there. But the UK has always had a complicated relationship with Europe. It was always in, but it was never quite in. And I can see a situation with Macedonia where like the UK, there was a natural sort of political alignment. That is to say that it should be represented. There's a lot of overlapping issues, particularly for landlocked countries. Culturally, quite different. But it's what I was saying earlier, that the EU as it was, and what even when it was the EEC, what it was then, what it is now, are very different enterprises. There is a real leaning and a backlash against cultural hegemony. So I would say Macedonia belongs politically to represent itself and represent its interests. I would be wary of anything that, like with Prespa, incidentally, anything that enforced upon Macedonia, anything at all that sacrificed or imposed on its educational freedom and its ability to decide and protect its own culture. So long answer to a short question is yes, I would say it belongs politically.
I think the subtext here...
There's cultural sensitivities around it. Definitely.
I think the subtext of this question is having to do with the rivalry between Europe and the West versus Russia. So I think the subtext of this question is, do you feel like Macedonia is more culturally compatible with the West or with Russia? I think that's I'd say, don't get mad at me, but I read this subtext.
It's an interesting question, and again, I would say I am not best placed to answer it because I'm not Macedonian. But I would say this: that so much time has now been expended, and so much money has now been expended on the European effort, that to start again would probably make me cry from the amount of work that would have to be undertaken from scratch if that you were looking at a completely geopolitical restart. It would be physically painful reading the subtext. Russia has its own problems at the moment, and again, is perhaps a separate conversation for a separate time. But from a time commitment perspective, it's Macedonia spent so much time on this that to throw it away now, or to throw a version of it away now, would be a waste of time. It would be an unforgivable waste of time.
This is a comment more than a question. I think we were talking about David Cameron. he says David Cameron was at least a man of his word. He said if Brexit is voted in, he will resign, and he did. In Macedonia, we had a treasonous idiot who said the same but did otherwise. All right, let's keep it civil. Reno says something along the line of the previous question. We do not share the same values with the current EU structure. Why would Macedonia be forced to join such union? It's not forced, but yeah.
It's one point on David Cameron, and one point on that, if I may, is that Cameron was a man of his word, but I do believe that he should have stayed around to put some kind of plan in motion as to how Brexit was handled. So he did the honourable thing, but the honourable thing sometimes can be a little bit too easy. As for the structural arrangement with the EU, again, it's a ground up Macedonian question. It's a question of not only what the EU would look like in 5-10 years, but also the conditions and the caveats that would be placed upon Macedonians if they were to join. So I'm not sure if there's a complete disalignment, but the EU is such a dripping roast at the moment and moving the goalpost all the time that what I say today could be completely different tomorrow if it decided to change itself overnight. I don't think it will, but the issue of compatibility is a complicated one, and it's right back to that, making Western audiences understand that you're taking A and B and they may work together, they may not, and understanding where the areas of confusion are. That's a broader narrative and a broader discussion that deserves attention.
All right, 2 more questions. What does Alastair think about the current behavior of Bulgaria towards Macedonia in the EU ascension process? Is it justified or archaic? I think we sort of touched on this.
I think that there's a real issue with successive Bulgarian governments and Greek governments of just perpetuating a narrative that Macedonia is the enemy, but doing very little to actually resolve practically policy issues. And if there's one thing that I've noticed in the Balkan sort of media and certain responses from certain governments is that there's an over-reliance on just blaming Macedonia for everything and saying that they're being uncooperative. That excuse gets you so far. It is archaic and it is grossly impractical to try and just continually complain about something but not do anything about it and then cry and throw your toys out of the pram when the victimization that you're perpetuating is challenged. You can't have your cake and eat it. But the wholesale dialogue that got successive, I don't like saying Bulgaria and Greece because I've got friends in both, but these successive governments, the impositions and the accusations and the rhetoric that they use is grossly inappropriate.
They're also poisoning the relationship between normal people. And
that's the worst offender, because you can't treat countries as if you don't have friends in each one and all the rest of it, that you get to a border and you just start hating people. But for a government to behave like that is not only rhetorical nonsense, but it's toxic, and they should be held to account for that policy behavior.
All right. And it says in Macedonia, one question from me, Celtics or Rangers?
No, that one I can get out of because I'm not a football fan, but I can get out of that one.
A lot of our viewers are football fans. And also a bonus one. Whose decision was it to name your son Alexander? Yours or your wife's?
It was actually mine. It was my idea. His full name is Alexander Vitomir James Stewart. So we tried to give him the best of both worlds for two cultures that we think that he's very fortunate to be a part of.
Vitomir, did I remember correctly? That's the name of your...
my father-in-law.
Your father-in-law. Wow, that's great.
My father-in-law, incidentally, I know by way of... There's a lot of cliches about father-in-laws and all the rest of it, but my father-in-law could not have been kinder for all these years with bringing me up to speed on Macedonian history, Macedonian culture, and it has just been just a massive support. So
Sounds like
yeah,
a
it
great
felt
guy.
appropriate to include his name to with my son.
All right, then we are at the end. Alastair, I would like to thank you for being a guest here.
Thank you.
I thought this was a really interesting discussion. I think our viewers heard a perspective on the situation that they don't often hear. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for your advocacy for, as a Macedonian, for your advocacy on behalf of Macedonians.
It's the least I can do. And
We,
thank you for having me.
we do
Thank you
such a
for-
bad we do such a bad job of advocating for ourselves. So we need all the help we can get.
Thank you for having me. And thank you to everyone who's taken part. It's been a great conversation.
All right, then we must have you back about Winston Churchill.
Yes,
We'll
absolutely.
see if we can arrange that. And thanks for everyone that tuned in and watched on all platforms that we're going on. And we will see you again on Monday. Have a great day. See ya.